Historians and journalists alike have painstakingly documented slavery in the U.S. up through the Civil War. But author Doug Blackmon says that we have overlooked a later aspect of slavery. In his new book, Slavery by Another Name, Blackmon documents the re-enslavement of black Americans that came well after the Civil War and lasted well into the 20th century. He joins me today to discuss it. Thanks so much for being here, Doug. I appreciate it. Sounds like this has been extremely well received, but I want to ask you firstly, why did you write the book?
Well, I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. I was born in the fall of 1964, right after Freedom Summer, when Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. And the little cotton town that I lived in as a child was a place of great racial tension and convulsion. I was in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin public education in Mississippi, black and white together, and go through 12 grades. So from the time that I was a very young child, I was interested in the question of why things were the way they were. And as an adult, became a journalist, and it led me to write about those things.
All right, there's an article that you wrote in 2001 that began to sort of unearth some of the basics, the tenets in this book. Tell me about the article.
Well, in 2001, I wrote a story that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, where I still work, about a place in Alabama where there were coal mines. And it was clear that at the time that U.S. Steel Corp had operated these coal mines in the early 20th century, that the workers there had been forced laborers, overwhelmingly black forced laborers, a good 40 years after the end of the Civil War. So I wrote a piece about that first.
And then it was extremely well received, and you got pressured actually. You didn't intend to write a book.
Well, that's true. I had worked on that story for almost a year, and it was a difficult story to write. It was an incredibly complicated historical riddle to solve. But once I had done that and had really established that the people who'd been in this mine and the bodies buried in a great burial field that I found on the outside of Birmingham, that these had been forced workers, once I'd written that story, there was this wonderful reaction to it, very emotional reaction, particularly from African Americans, and a lot of suggestions of writing a book. But initially, I was reluctant to do it, but I was convinced to do it, and I thought it would take a couple of years, and it took 7.
You also said there was an impetus that you felt that the United States had asked countries like Germany and Japan to process their history, but was not unwilling to process its own.
Well, I think that's true, and that was part of my interest originally in the topic, was that particularly in the South, but America as a whole is a country that has never looked backward in the kind of scrutinizing way about our own sort of social guilt, if you will, for the bad things that happened in our past. And I think that that has led us to minimize some things, such as this, where very, very terrible things happened, that we know some of the facts of what happened, but we don't really accept the severity or the consequences of them.
Let's look at the content. Essentially, there were laws on the books, and they were what we would call sort of petty or small, but an African American talking too loudly in the presence of a woman, for instance, could get you arrested, correct?
Right. There were a whole battery of these laws that had been passed by all of the southern states, and the laws didn't say, in the language of the laws themselves, it didn't say this will only be enforced against blacks, but that was effectively how many of them worked. It was illegal, for instance, for a farm worker to change employers without permission from the first employer. And that was something that, obviously, the intent of that was to make it impossible for a valued farm worker to move to another plantation. And unable to do that, that made that person and his family vulnerable to whatever conditions or abuses the farm owner wanted to do. And there were similar laws about vagrancy, and if you couldn't prove you had a job, if you tried to sell the cotton you grew after dark, you were subject to arrest, because this was to make you sell your cotton to the people you were supposed to sell it to. All of these things created an environment in the South in which African American men, the vast majority of them, were unable to feel secure in their lives unless they had the specific protection of a white man.
All right, and so essentially you were able to come up with the empirical data after spending months and months in courthouses that actually showed that, say, on Friday, when there appeared to be a labor shortage, that there might be a group of African American men picked up, couldn't pay their fines, and by Monday they were laborers.
Right. There's a story that a lot of us might have learned in history classes, but there's a version of events after the Civil War that says that the freed slaves in the South were ill-equipped for freedom and sort of emotionally unready for freedom, and that they went on a sort of rampage across the South of thievery and other kinds of petty crimes, and that was why the white South responded with these incredibly severe laws. The reality was, though, if you go back and look at the arrest records, and there are thousands and thousands of them, millions of entries that still exist today, you can reconstruct what people were arrested for, what the actual conditions were, and the truth is these crime waves didn't occur. It's a myth, and the reality is that you would have a place where there had been no arrests of any kind for months at a time, and then suddenly 15 or 20 black men would be swept up in a day or 2 days and then delivered days later to a forced labor mine.
Was there anything that really shocked you?
Well, I was shocked. I mean, I'm a kid from the South. I grew up in Mississippi, so I know that black people didn't get a fair shake in the South in the first 3/4 of the 20th century. So that didn't surprise me. I knew that people couldn't vote. We all know those things. But what did shock me was, one, the enormity of this, the enormous, the fantastic numbers of people who lived in the shadow of this threat. But in addition to that, the level of brutality that was involved. Because once people were drawn into this system, whether it was through many sharecropping situations, farm tenancy, being a prisoner through the state court system, or simply being kidnapped off the road and sold as a slave. And that was still happening in 1900, 1910. I document dozens of those cases. But once that had happened, it wasn't just that these men were being held on farms. They were horribly brutalized, whipped, starved. They lived in absolute squalor without medical care. I mean, the level of the inhumanity was shocking to me.
Why has it been that this has not been brought to light before?
Well, and aspects of this have been brought to light, and there are wonderful historians of the 20th century who have written about aspects of this. But and many of them I rely on for parts of the book, and some of them were advisors to me even as I wrote the book. But there are reasons why both white Americans and black Americans have had an instinct toward a kind of amnesia around this. And that is, it's fairly obvious for whites. This story, this interpretation of these events, contradicts some of our most basic mythology about who we are. It defies the idea that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, even though Lincoln did. It's just that then they were re-enslaved, many of them. So it's obvious why many whites would rather not remember this, or would rather remember it as something less than what it really was. For black Americans, it's hard to remember this because this was a painful and humiliating thing. And in many, many black families that I have spoken to, it is the case that at the end of their lives, the grandparent or the great-grandparent would finally begin to open up about these kinds of stories, of things that happened to them during this era, but stories which they had chosen not to pass on because they were too painful. These were things they didn't want their descendants to have to bear. But my point in this book is that these are things we have to know about. If we're going to understand why things are the way they are today, we have to know this. If we want to forge some sort of shared vision for the future, we have to be able to be honest about this aspect of the past.